I grew up at St. Peter's Evangelische Lutheranische Kirche in Forest Park, Illinois. I didn't grow up in Forest Park, the zoo. I grew up in Forest Park, the town. And 1889, the cornerstone was laid for that congregation. And so I grew up in the German Lutheran Church, and it was, you could always tell how people were feeling when they came to worship. This is the way they looked. During the sermon, when there was a baptism, and when they were going home. So they had a range of emotions there, but then I went to seminary in Pennsylvania, and my first call was up in northern Illinois in a town called Crystal Lake, and then in 1980 I was called by the wider church to come to the St. Louis area, Lake St. Louis, and to plant Living Lord. So I rang doorbells and called on people and gathered people, and I always saw my responsibility, my call to be a reverse traffic cop. You know, traffic cops stand in the intersection and call people this way and then this way and make sure that they don't run into each other. My job as a pastor evangelist has always been to stand in the intersection and cause people to run into each other. So I think that's what this is all about, is how do we engage the world? How do we engage the world as people of faith, especially a world in which we now live in, which has less people in church than it used to, okay? And we have a great commission to make this good news known, right? So we're gonna, I'll try not to go fast, but we'll just stop when we have to stop, and then we'll keep going, right, next week. So first thing, you have pieces of paper in front of you, which is sort of an outline of some of the things that we should probably cover today, and then next week you'll get another sheet of paper. But the first thing I'd like you to do is get out a pen or a crayon or anything if you have something, and write down the names of anyone you've known, at least 2 or 3 people that you've known who have stopped attending any church. Because I bet you do know somebody who has stopped going to church. Right? While you're doing that, so the name of the book that I'm coming from is called The Great DeChurching by Jim Davis and Michael Graham, also with the data gathered by a guy named Ryan Berge. So it's actually a pretty good book. So you know anybody who stopped going to church? While you're writing down the names, in 1870 to 1895, after the Civil War, church attendance doubled. Now, of course, there were a whole lot less people in the United States of America, and the United States of America was a lot smaller, well, then it is now. But anyway, doubled in attendance in those years. In the 1950s, we had the baby boom. Okay, all the soldiers coming back from the war, all the women, who had been working now had to leave their places of work, and now we're at home. And suburbs grew, and babies showed up. One of the largest generations, ever. And of course, the churches grew in the 1950s. As suburbs were being built, as people were having babies, people had their children baptized, and suburban churches grew like crazy everywhere, of every kind, right? From the beginning about 1990 through 2025, 40 million people have left the church. 40 million. Everybody say that. 40 million. So if you think that we don't have a mission field anywhere we live, right? The United States is now a mission field. Churches in South Africa, in the African continent, are sending missionaries to the United States. Wow. Think about that, okay? So, in this great de-churching, people who have left church, Couple of quotes. No theological tradition, age group, ethnicity, political affiliation, education level, geographic location, or income bracket has escaped the DeChurching of America. There isn't a place where people haven't stopped going, all right? So this isn't just here. This isn't just in the city. It isn't just in the country. It's everywhere. From 1970 to 1990, the share of people who had no religious affiliation had risen only 2%. 2%. You know what those they call them some, right? On the census form it says none. So we call them the nuns. You have no, so people who have identified themselves as having none only went up 2%. Since 1990, the nuns have grown by a percentage point or two every year. Okay. So a couple of factors that we should not overlook in talking about why things have happened the way they've happened. Number one, have you ever heard of the word Christendom? What's it mean? I have no idea. I've heard it, right? Right? So it's this idea that the world is Christian. Right? That we live in a Christian nation. That everything that someone who's not a Christian is the anomaly. Right? That the Christian faith and the Christian culture and the Christian value sets are what's underneath of everything. So when I was growing up, you couldn't, everybody went to church in the 50s, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't true, but it seemed like. Do you know in the 1950s, when I was going to school at Garfield Elementary School, it was at the end of the block, and my church was at the other end of the block. And on Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock, anybody who had a church left school. It was called release time. And we would walk up the block to our church. And we'd have whatever the program was that the church wanted to offer, we had that. And the public school emptied out. And people went to their, imagine that, right? Imagine that today. Yeah. It was that way in a lot of places. Christendom, that was Christendom, right? Well, Christendom began to, get shaky in the 90s. So the idea that America and Christianity are synonymous began to, crack, I guess you could say, right? With the 1990s. Ever heard of the phrase post-modern? Have you ever heard of that? Yeah. Okay, you know what postmodern is? No. It's kind of a Philip. That's why we have this. So, toward the end of the 20th century, which is defined by modernity. One of the things that is about modern is there was always an assumption that there was always an answer to every question. There's an answer to every question. Yeah? And there is a thing called truth. Capital T. Right? Truth. And we can talk about it, we can debate about it, but there is truth. Yes? Yeah. How many of you grew up with there are things that are true? Right? Okay. Postmodern. I began to discover this in the 90s. When teaching confirmation, which everybody should have an opportunity to do, just
so much fun.
It is so much fun. Where in the 90s, all of a sudden, the consequence of this shift of modern to postmodern was young people were taught that everybody has the right to their own opinion. Yes? Yeah. I mean, you may see it that way, but I see it a different way, right? And so that's one of the things that happened during postmodern is truth was called into question. Because your truth may be not my truth. And what's true for people who are from the North American hemisphere may not be the same culturally, right? A cultural truth. They used to be called mores, right? In another continent. And, right? So truth came into question, and my truth. And then we had a thing happen in the 2000 teens, where we had this new term, right? Fake news. That doesn't even make sense, right? Doesn't make sense. Fake news. It's not really news. Okay, but except that the thing is that people have embraced it, right? But that's not news, which is really another way of saying that's not true. That's not true. It's a fake truth. So there's been this shift in sort of an underlying philosophy of the way the world works and the way that things are. And in that shift, along came these questions and these opinions. And what does the church stand for? Jesus says something about, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If all truths are now relative to what you think, then one of the proclamations and claims of Jesus is up in the air. Yes? So, when we shifted, the shift, and you don't get a choice. You don't get a choice to say, well, I'm just going to stay in the modern era. Nope, we're in the postmodern. The fallout from our increasingly polarized society, the rise of the religious right, and the reactions to the polarization that's happening in our country is one of the underlying foundations for why people have stopped going to church, right? Because congregations work really hard, if they want to work hard at all, work really hard at getting their arms out and saying, we want to welcome everyone, right? What news do you watch? You watch Fox, or do you watch MSNBC? How many people watch both Fox and CNN? Some people say, I want to hear it both. Otherwise, but there's all kinds of, you can pick your news, and what they say is that's the echo chamber. All you hear is what you want to hear. And everybody's saying it and making fun of the other side. Well, when that happens in the church, guess what happens? Somebody goes, I don't want to hear that from the pastor, from the Bible study. Whatever is not the thing that the way I see it, right? And the impact of the internet. Technology, postmodernism, what people say the 500-year shift, that's a whole nother adult forum. But so comes the question. Who is DeChurching? Who are those 40 million? The authors of this book and the guy who's all about the data, they did great number of surveys. And they asked people, like, do you go to church? Do you not go to church? Did you used to go to church? And they took out of the survey anybody who said, I'm in church still. And they took out of the survey anybody who said, I don't believe in God and never went to church. So we're only talking about people who used to go, who don't go now. And then they asked even more questions. And so there's great data in here. And they've worked hard at sort of saying, here's what it's about. So who is DeChurching? 21% of the people who have dechurched identify themselves as Republicans. 23% of those who have dechurched identify themselves as independents. 29% who have dechurched identify themselves as Democrats. Okay? So it doesn't matter. Okay? Political party doesn't matter. And not all the reasons, sorry, is what happens. Not all the reasons that people at the church is the same. Two important categories. One, people who have casually de-churched. We're gonna talk, when we get into, they identify 5 groups of people who de-churched, and we'll talk more about casual Christians. But people who have casually de-churched, stopped going, got out of the habit, got moved, whatever, all these reasons, right? But no reason, nothing happened that caused me to de-church. So those are the casually de-churched. Then there are the de-churched casualties. People where something did happen to them. I used to wear a collar everywhere I went. Rang doorbells, people would invite me in. 11 o'clock in the morning, woman would come to the door. Pastor, come on in. No. First of all, my goal was not, I was only to be there for like 5 minutes, introduce myself, say hi. If you're interested, I'll call you back. But people would invite me in their houses. Today, my wife will not answer the door. Right? They can leave something on my door, right? She doesn't answer the door, much less invite somebody in. In the 1990s, I used to walk around the mall with my daughter. That's of course what you did with your daughter when you had an adolescent. You walked around the malls. I'd pick her up from school. We go to the mall. I'd be wearing the collar. Pre-1990s. Hello, father. Hello, father. She gets so mad. He is not your father. He's my father. 90s, I could tell something changed. I'd be walking around the mall with her and people would look at me. And you could tell, you could read the nonverbals. There was something going on that they didn't like what they were seeing. I don't know if it was because I had a collar or because I had a collar and I was walking around with a teenage girl. Whatever it was, you know what happened in the 90s, right? In the 90s is when the abuse that was taking place in not just the Roman Catholic Church, by the way, the abuse began to be public. So here I'm wearing a black cotton shirt with a white collar, priest, kid, right? And I could tell when I called on people, this no longer was an entree. And I went from collar to tie. Because the whole point is take the barrier down. Don't put a barrier up. But there was a barrier already in the 90s. I could sense it. So 90s, something began to change. And there are people who would identify themselves as I don't go to church anymore because the church, a person in the church did something to me. Church casualty. These, by the way, are probably the most difficult people to re-engage. We'll talk about that too, hopefully. And then there's other factors, anxiety and loneliness and COVID and all kinds of other things. But these are factors in why people have stopped.
Pardon me, I'm sorry.
Yes, please intervene.
Collected post-COVID or pre-COVID?
Yes. Post-COVID.
Okay.
So this is up, I mean, I don't know. They're talking about what's going on now.
Okay, very
So,
recent.
2023.
Okay, thank you.
Proposed. Does it work? And then the rise of secularism. Read a quote. For centuries, the Western world has increasingly made major life decisions based upon what we can see and touch in our temporal world instead of on the eternal and supernatural claims of the Bible. As a mode of philosophy, it was called materialism. The only things that are real are things that are solid, real. That's not the same as I want to go buy stuff, right? It was just the material world is what we see and taste and touch, and it's what is the foundation of everything. That was a shift in the beginning in the early 20th century, 1900s. This materialistic view. which shifts you away from the eternal and the supernatural world, right? Which is what our business is, right? So we have to define how does the real world, the nature, how does it connect to, and how does the supernatural, the eternal connect to our world? We have to talk about that because it used to be assumed, and now you have to say, right? You have to testify. There are those who became disenfranchised with the church because it is too synchronized with the right-wing politics, and those who became disenfranchised with the church because it was not synchronized enough. So there are people who say, right, this is the way the world is, and it ought to be, and it also got a political view to it, right? But then there are those who say, that's not the way I see the world. So people left church because because the church was connected to a sort of a more conservative, I'll call it conservative, or fundamental, and then those who left the church because it wasn't connected to that worldview, right? Ergo the numbers, right? So, and in one generation, what about this? In one generation, the children of the DeChurched will become unchurched. Right? So when I was growing up, we all left church after confirmation. Right? We took a little break, went to high school, went to college, got married somewhere in college or after college, and what did we do? We went back to church. We got married at the church, and then we started having kids. We got them baptized. That started breaking down in the 60s, 70s. People left the church after confirmation and didn't go back. So now we already have a generation of people who didn't grow up in the church. So they're unchurched after their parents dechurched. So 40 million, right? Okay, so who are the DeChurched? The book. The book talks about 5 categories, and I think I got them listed there. First category is cultural Christians. See, Elaine and Morris are mad, and now they're making. Okay. She told me that they would get mad about 20 minutes to 12. Yeah. It's kind of like having a pre-planned funeral. So cultural Christians, 52% of the unchurched, of the DeChurched are cultural Christians. Right?
What is that?
They went to church because everybody was going to church. They went to church on Christmas and Easter. They went to church on Christmas and Easter, and when there was a baptism or when there was a confirmation, or it was what we do, right? But what's underneath cultural Christians is no solid anchor. I mean, and I don't want to make this sound judgmental, but there's no solid anchor, right? So if they move, if there's a kerfuffle at the church, they just stop. And again, there may not be anything big deal. So reasons for the cultural Christians identified.
It works.
It works, okay. 22%, I'm sorry, wrong page. 18% said my friends no longer attending church. 18% said attending became inconvenient. I had other stuff I had to do. Suffering changed my view of God. Another 17%. Personal suffering or suffering in the world, right? How many of you know somebody who said, my life was fine and then it got bad, where was God? Right? The Job question, right? And Job's friends answered, you must have done something. The cultural answer to why there's suffering is, what did you do? Which, by the way, Jesus doesn't agree with that idea. Right? And by the way, neither does the book of Job, even though about 2/3 of the book of Job are the religious answer. Then God comes on the scene and says, "What? Who are these people that are speaking wrong?" Right? Okay. I wanted to express my gender identity. I left church. I moved to a new community. That was 17%, 16% too restrictive of my sexual freedom. 60% a scandal involving clergy. 16% I chose to worship completely online. So I stopped going, but I kind of go, right? That would obviously be a post-COVID answer, wouldn't it? Because nobody did that before, except lay your hand on the television, I'll heal you. Right? The messages that were no longer relevant to my life, 15%. Instances of racism, 15%. I had other priorities, 15%. I began to doubt God's goodness, 15%. I began to doubt God's existence, 15%. So it just doesn't fit in the way that my world is right now, right? For the most part, they aren't theological. Notice, right? Which you'll also hear is most of the reasons people de-church is not theological, right? And we'll get to that in terms of when we get to the hope. The cultural Christians had the lowest percentage of orthodox questions when asked, "Do you believe in God?" The surveyors just basically broke down the Apostles' Creed. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in God as creator? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in Jesus as Savior? And they just Cultural Christians who weren't moored deeply to the faith of the church have the lowest response. Yeah, maybe. No, doesn't matter. So those are what they call the orthodox questions. Things began to change in their 20s and they never went back. Career, family, other stuff. So that's the cultural Christians. Then there's another group they identified as DeChurched mainline evangelicals. Think Baptist. Okay. Southern Baptist, how many of you know somebody who maybe belongs to a First Baptist church or Fifth Baptist church? Right? Baptists are pretty mainline folks, right? And I remember when I was in Christell, in Lake St. Louis, there was a Baptist church, Episcopal church, and us, and we had a great relationship between pastors. We traded pulpits. But we were LCA and then ELCA, so I think probably I wasn't supposed to do it anyway, but we did it, our congregations work together in town, so we flipped pulpits. Bob Thompson, great pastor at First Baptist Church, unbelievably ecumenical. He said, "Now, just so you know, I preach long sermons. Don't make me look bad." So I actually wrote 2 sermons. I wrote a sermon, got my guitar out and played it, and then gave another sermon, so that I could get to 25 minutes. Nowadays, I can preach 25 minutes without even thinking about it. You know why that is? Because I'm this age and I have a lot to say, and I only have so many sermons left in me. I preach a lot longer than I used to. But when I went to the Episcopal church, he said, "Don't make me look bad. I don't give children's sermons." So I said, "Well, I do, and you have to give one when you come to look at me." So think Baptists. Most likely dropped out post-COVID. So the cultural Christians have been falling away for a long time. Mainline evangelicals, COVID. And here are the reasons they gave. 22%, I moved to a new community, therefore I didn't get connected to a new place. 16%, attending became inconvenient. 15%, I got divorced. Think about, and that means something, right? There's judgment on that, right? Or I got remarried, judgment. COVID got me out of the habit, 15%. I didn't fit into the congregation, 14%. I didn't experience much love in the congregation, 12%. So, DeChurched mainline evangelicals, 100% of those who were surveyed, who would be identified as this, 100% of them said they'd go back.
Would go back. They would
They
go back.
They would go back.
Wow.
And for various reasons. Someone's inviting me, new relationships, new pastor, right? Or God tells me I need to go back, right? So based on their orientation, all right? Next group. Evangelicals. How many people read the Ex-Evangelicals book? How would you define an evangelical versus a mainline? So not Baptist, not Assembly of God, more like the big community churches, okay? The Christian, yeah, we're Christians. So the evangelicals often identify the reason for leaving the church as they're casualties. They kept hammering me. My daughter came out as gay and she was judged. Where's the love? I have a waitress at one of the restaurants where we go for, everybody has a restaurant they go to, right, for morning. And when you're old and retired, you get to go there like all the time. And we have a Bible study, and because of course Christians have taken over the coffee shops in the morning, you know, right? We have to take our Bible studies and take it out to the world. Now the coffee shop has nobody but Christians studying the Bible, and we squeezed everybody else out. We went out there to be a witness, now we're witnessing to ourselves. There's a Catholic group over there, and then there's the Lutherans. Oh my gosh. We gotta find another place. I think it's a soccer stadium. But evangelicals, for them, institutions aren't working. This tends to be a lower income in this group. And so the institution of the church isn't working for them, and the institutions of society aren't working for them. Many of these folks have fallen through the cracks of society because their life changed. Divorce, you know, same thing, same set, right? Same set of things. But so that what they say is, I don't fit in the congregation, I moved to a new community, I didn't experience much love. That's 18%, didn't experience much love. This waitress said to us, I grew up, my dad was a pastor at the evangelical church. He got mistreated, and I don't know how I could go to a church that says my daughter is going to hell. I can't go there. So gone, right? Negative experience in the evangelical church. Attending wasn't convenient. These are 15%. I disagree with the politics of the congregation. Boy, no one ever does that, right? I no longer believed what the congregation believed, 14%. I disagreed with the politics of the clergy. Okay, so again, you hear anything theological in there? It's not there. This group is also willing to return. Well, I should say all of them, no matter what. Guess who's the lowest percentage of people willing to return? Cultural Christians, and those who have been abused in the church. But in terms of how we define these folks, no, aside from the people who've been abused, no group is under 50%. So 50% of the people who de-church in these categories would go back. That's the hope that we have inside of this information, right? Then the next category, now I'm really I want to start talking even faster. Black, indigenous, people of color. This is one of the higher income levels of the DeChurch. Right? And their reasons, it's the smallest group of DeChurched people, 14%. This is the smallest group. Disproportionately in the Southeast. Highest level of education in any of the subcategories. And they're similar to cultural Christians in terms of income. So, reasons for leaving, 19%, I struggle to fit in or belong to the church. You hear a theme? My life got really busy and I had other priorities. Oh, sorry, hang on. I was just reading that. No, there it is, sorry. College education caused me to question my faith. There were a lack of people my age. I had a bad experience with evangelicals. This is still the other group, right? I wanted to explore my sexuality. Young professionals said I struggled to fit in church. I found my community online or at work. I wanted to enjoy the benefits of my surplus finance. So if I don't give 10%, I have 10% more. There were a lack of people my age. My faith was not my own. I borrowed it from my family. Isn't that an interesting response? It's what mom and dad believe, and it never connected. Or at least they look back and say it never really became mine. I had some bad experiences. I had my life got really busy. Again, this group is very willing to return. Very willing. Then we have, you were wondering where we fit? Here we are. Mainline Protestants or Catholics. Mainline Protestants and Catholics are almost unidentifiable, undistinguishable. Isn't that interesting, right? But it's not surprising, is it? Right? You would say this is the main body of Americans, and then mainline. So there's a reason they call them mainline, right? Mainline Baptists, and then the mainline Protestants, and the Catholics. We are all Americans. We see ourselves as churched Americans, right? And I'll bet most of those churches have the flag up in the front, right? It's almost synonymous. De-churched Catholics were more likely to cite political friction, misogyny, so anti-women, right? And sexual freedom. And de-churched mainline Protestants more likely to cite personal suffering. So it was hard stuff, something happened to me. And what I'd learned, grow up in church, is if you love God, then life is fine, right? God loves you, everything will be good, right? Now we're back to Job, right? Even though pastors don't preach that, people hear that, right? Or shouldn't say it that way. There are a lot of pastors who do preach that. God, it's Calvinism, right? Best thing about Calvinism is that God decides you're going to be successful in advance. And there's nothing you can do about it. And then you're also, the downside of that is God already decided you're not going to be successful. So there's nothing you can do about that either. It's a nice philosophy, theology, right? And another reason that the mainline Protestants stopped going is the church wasn't doing enough in the community. And besides cultural Christians, the mainline Protestants were the earliest ones to start leaving. I think it has something to do with our embrace of what I would call a more liberal theology and a more liberal approach to scripture. And so it was sort of the beginning of whatever you think, right? And so it became less It's the way it is. And so it's like, well, if I go, God loves me anyway, you know? How many of us are universalists? No. How many of you believe that God's gonna forgive everybody and we're all going to heaven? No, yeah, I kind of do, right? And what if I added, through Jesus, God's gonna forgive everybody and everybody's going to heaven? Now we're getting to see it, yeah. So what does it matter? Since Jesus has already done it for us. Our problem is that we don't know how to deal with but what happens if we don't, right? Because I don't want to lead with, you're going to hell. Right? When I was out calling, there were people calling it, if you died today, where would you spend eternity? That was the first words they rang the doorbell, you open the door. If you died today, where would you spend eternity? That was called the Kennedy campaign. Anybody have that invitation? Yeah. Well, of course, most people go, well, let me tell you, right? I never did that. That wouldn't even be where I want to go. That's not where I want to start. I don't want to scare the hell out of people. I want to love them into heaven, right? That's my personal, vision of what ministry is, the grace of God, right? But I have people who tell me, Pastor Roy, you need to tell people how they're supposed to live, right? Yeah, and people have lots of questions, and if the church doesn't give answers, then they're going to go to some other church that has all the answers. Right? We live in a world now that is dominated by the idea that everybody has an opinion. So telling people how they have to live is a non-starter for a lot of folks. Okay, so this is about as far as I figured. I got a few more hours to go. Okay, so the hint of hope. Many people are willing to return. The majority of DeChurched persons of all types still believe God, Jesus, Spirit. When asked how willing they would be to go back to church, 51% said they either are somewhat or very willing to go back. Another quote. Despite the fact that about 40% of Americans never attend church and 30% say they have no religious affiliation, just 1 in 10 Americans say God does not exist. Or that we have no way to know if God exists. 1%. Pretty small. So, evangelists here in this room, don't worry about that 1%. Okay? Let somebody else work on the 1%. You get to work on the 99%. Right? If you run into somebody who is not going to church because literally they were abused in church, simply love them. Simply love them. That's a long-term project if you're trying to get them to reconnect to the church. They may still love God. They just got abused by the church. Just love them. Which will actually, by the way, give them a different picture of what the church is, right? While acknowledging the great blessing we experience in the United States, we as a church need to embrace and display that we have a greater citizenship that transcends our political views and our national identity. The issue at hand is a discipleship issue. Right? This is the authors. America is changing, and this creates fear in many people because at some level, all change involves loss. It should not surprise us that people are either consciously or subconsciously putting their ultimate hope in the secular to fix the loss they feel. Right? Make America great again. We have the solution. They're going in the wrong direction. We'll fix it. It doesn't matter which political party you're listening to, they have the answer to fix what's wrong. Problem is when they get into power, they have no more answers than anybody else. Right? It's a pretty complicated system. As church leaders, it is our calling to minister to people who are experiencing loss of any kind by pointing them to Jesus, who is the only hope in this life and in the next. Right? There's the evangelical Lutheran Church, the good news, right? That we have to proclaim. Okay. I'm gonna do two more things, right? Real quick. Columbia, Missouri. Columbia, Missouri, huh? And actually built this church. So these authors say this: we gave our early research to a Presbyterian church, EPA, maybe Evangelical Presbyterian Church, EPA, called The Crossing. Maybe you've heard it. There's Crossing Communities, not the one that we have in Chesterfield Valley, but The Crossing shows itself up in a lot of college towns. There's one up in DeKalb, and there's one in Decatur. Anyway, so it's a Presbyterian church called The Crossing. They gave the early research, and they began initiatives to engage this group of people. Some initiatives were technology-based and some were more personal. They identified DeChurched evangelicals whose DeChurching was based on belonging. They didn't feel like they belonged. And in just a number of months, they had over 120 formerly DeChurched people worshiping. I didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't know anybody there. I'm different than them. Those are belonging statements, right? So they worked on that. Now, of course, again, this is Columbia, Missouri, right? So they probably were aimed at younger age, right? But the point is, based on the data, they said, well, if that's the issue of people who are like us, so they weren't trying to get a Lutheran to show up, right? They were looking for an evangelical, and they connected. When they connected, the people started showing up. So I don't know if you've ever seen these three words. Believe, belong. Now the last one of the B is become, but in this case, act like it. Okay? Act like you say, right? Which is the first part of the stories today in the Bible, right? Act like you believe. So a couple of this is inside the category of there's hope here, right? First is most of these people who have de-churched, the issue isn't faith. The issue isn't do they believe in Jesus. So the last thing you want to do to a de-churched person is give them a lecture about how they ought to believe. They already believe. And one of the reasons they aren't there is because someone lectured them, right? Whatever the category is, right? So don't assume they don't believe anymore. And begin with a conversation that is relationship based, that builds up trust. So for many people, it's motivation, not believing, which is the issue. Right? So don't lecture, ask questions. That's probably what we'll talk about in the fall, right? That this is a conversation. Conversation's always got two parts to it. So we have to listen first. Belonging, so again, same thing. You don't lecture someone into belonging. You have to build a relationship, right? So if belonging is the issue, the church is not an event. This is another quote. It's a family. It's not a perfect family, but it's a real spiritual family. It's not surprising that the de-churched indicate a higher level of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Anxiety, depression, and loneliness.
Cause or effect?
Yes. But I think part of it is that's the world we're living in, right? I have a thing called Flipboard on my phone. So I can flip through different, news articles. I spent about 15, 20 minutes at that. I'm anxious. I'm scared, right? Why do I want to read this? There's no good news in here because somebody's ruining the world. And I read both sides. So somebody means that if I read both sides of the news, means that everybody's ruining the world. and who is the most isolated group of people in our American culture right now? Adolescents. Adolescents. Teenagers and 20-year-olds who are the most connected in the world are the most in our culture are the most isolated and alone in our culture because of this.
They're connected to that.
They're connected to this. I mean, this is sort of the caricature story. My wife and I were on a trip out east, and we stopped in, I think, Pennsylvania we like to go to non-chain restaurants. So we found a little Mexican restaurant that didn't have a name we recognized. We sat there. We were having a great conversation. There was mom, 3 kids, having lunch together. Everybody on their phone. We were sitting right next to them. We were talking, they weren't. Well, they didn't interrupt our conversation because they weren't talking. The funny joke is the one kid at the table sends a text to the other kid at the table. This food is awful. So we have people who are so connected by this, but isolated, also judged. Right? How many suicides? We keep getting that, right? Because they've been attacked on social media. So, what can we, as the church, offer to that? Right? And then finally, worship is important. Corporate worship is important because it connects us. And behavior beyond worship is important. Now, Chris gives his sermon again, right? Right? Connections are important. Behaving as we believe is important. So we gather together because we know it's important to gather and worship together. But we also know it's important for us to go out into the world that God so loves and behave like we talk about, right? Because long ago, people said church folks are hypocrites. Right? Okay, so my last question is, what's our goal? Trinity Lutheran Church. Our goal is to grow the church 5%. Don't write this down. This is the first 3 friends of Job. Our goal is to grow the church 5% a year for the next 20 years. So I'll take 600 so we get 30 people this year. Then that'll be 630. I can't do the math after that, but we'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. 30%, 5%, 5%. All you need 30 more people. That's our goal, right? The church, in order to be successful, needs to grow, right? And then if it's growing and successful, then they'll have more money. And then we can hire more people, and then we can have more electricity for more programs. That's the whole goal of the church, right? Is to grow. Right? Or is it a mission question? It's not enough to say our goal is to grow just because we want to grow. Right? That's not, so goal statements are not mission statements. Go make disciples, Jesus said, and he didn't stutter when he said it. Go make disciples. Even before he was crucified, 2 different times he sent out the 12, and another time he sent out the 70. And he sent them out in Luke, the 70, to places, towns and places where he himself was going to go. So they were the front end, stir it up. Jesus shows up. I told you he was coming, right? One of the best calls I ever made was I rang the doorbell, lady came to the door. You're Pastor Roy. Yes. My friend Alice, 2 blocks away, said you would be here soon. Alice was a Baptist, and she said, I'm not going to go to his church, but I think you might like to. It's a mission question. Why do we want Trinity to grow? So more people know Jesus, grace, promise, forgiveness, love. All the people who said, I didn't feel like I fit there. All the people said, I didn't experience much love there. I didn't see them living the life into the world there. It's a mission question. Why should we grow? Because Jesus tells us, go do this. By the way, I'll supply the Spirit. You just go. Okay? So we'll stop there.
Have you noticed, or the author noticed, that a lot of the DeChurched have been force-fed religion as a child or a teenager?
That's in there. And toward the end of the book, they call it the something like the missed handoff, the dropped handoff. Like generations are supposed to hand it off, right? And then if you don't get that handoff, right? So yes, there's that factor. That's the one that in the one group that said, I was borrowing the faith that wasn't mine. I think even the way we teach confirmation, right? The way we teach confirmation changed from prehistoric days when I started, because we had to talk about the dinosaurs as they were going by the window. From when I took confirmation, and then when I started teaching confirmation, we had a test at the end. And how many of you on the Sunday of confirmation had to stand up and answer questions? My pastor Elise was nice enough to say, you'll get this one, you'll get this one, you'll get this one. And God help us if Johnny was missing, because that would mean we hadn't studied the right question. But there was the what they call it was the question time, right? You had to stand up in the examination, right? Tests and examination. That like the faith is information to master. And we shift over the time, and I've been pastor, we shifted from information to memorize and to know, like that faith is belief, intellectual, to experience and to testimony. We would bring people in and say, tell us about your faith. We wanted them to catch the faith, to make it their own faith. So I don't want you to go, I don't want you to have Pastor Roy's faith. I want you to have your faith. So we're going to talk about the Bible, we're going to talk about the faith, and then you figure out what yours is and then testify to it. So it wasn't tests, it was testimony. Well, okay. It was an hour.
Thank you very much. Perfect.
I'm only used to it. I hate 45 minutes. Not gonna work. This is, so just be
Yes.
next week in 30 minutes.